taking all of that great information that was gathered through the specific requirements for assessing an emotional behavioral disability, after conducting a comprehensive special education evaluation, the IEP team is going to determine if the child demonstrates frequent and intense observable behaviors, either over a long period of time or of sudden onset due to an emerging mental health condition, which includes a diagnosis by a licensed mental health professional, which adversely affects the child's educational performance. The behaviors must occur in academic setting in school, in a non-academic setting in school, and in the child's home or community. So we're going to start to look at each of these. The IEP team will determine if the student exhibits one or more of the characteristics of observable behaviors of an emotional behavioral disability. For each characteristic, the team must explain or reference data or evidence using the documentation from the requirements that Tim just described. The defining 7 characteristics or patterns of behavior are not necessarily apparent in every student identified with an emotional behavioral disability, though the team will need to identify pervasive patterns rather than discrete behavioral responses. Excuse me. All right, for characteristic 1, behaviors that interfere with the development and maintenance of age and grade appropriate interpersonal relationships. The student's behavioral response interferes with the ability to demonstrate age, grade, and culturally appropriate interpersonal skills, such as sympathy, warmth and empathy towards others, initiating positive interactions, establishing and maintaining friendships, give and take in interactions, communicating wants and needs, and other skills found demonstrated by the majority of their peers, again, of similar age, background, culture, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, abilities, or socioeconomic status. It's not a question of getting along with others. It's a question of whether the student's behavior interferes with their ability to interact with others and sustain relationships. If the student has established friendships, team member judgments on the student's friends are not relevant to this analysis. In cases where a student is perceived to have objectionable friends, implicit bias may appear, and team members may not substitute their ideas of what is an appropriate peer group. The team will need to consider if the relationships are satisfactory to the student's perceptions of relationships. For characteristic 2, observable affective or behavioral responses during routine daily activities inconsistent with the norms of the child or the child's community. So here, the observable affective or behavioral response of concern should be compared to the response of peers of similar circumstances. Developmental norms in comparison with peers in those similar circumstances should be used to determine whether the affective or behavioral responses are unusual, inconsistent, or inappropriate. Consideration should also be given if the affective or behavioral response is atypical, different, or inconsistent for the student and for which no observable reason exists. The IEP team will need to consider the ethnic and cultural norms of the student and their family through direct input from the student and family, including how a student's culture may be reflected in both the absence or presence of an affective or behavioral response. The IEP team should take into account whether a student's home or school situation is disrupted by stress, discrimination, recent changes, or traumatic or unexpected events that could be contributing to the student's behavioral response. However, such evidence does not preclude the determination of a disability category. Affective or behavioral responses should not be secondary manifestation attributable to substance abuse, medication, or a general medical condition like hypothyroidism or diabetes. These characteristics remain largely unchanged from the old rule. For For pervasive unhappiness, depression, or anxiety, the student must demonstrate a consistent pattern of unhappiness, depression, or anxiety over a long period of time. This pattern is not a temporary response to a situational factor or due to a medical condition. A diagnosis by a licensed mental health professional of depression or anxiety is not required to meet this characteristic. If the student does have a diagnosis, the IEP team must document and consider the diagnosis while conducting assessments to investigate whether the symptoms of the diagnosis are evident at school and adversely affect the student's educational performance. The physical symptoms or fears must be linked with personal or school problems with no known medical cause. Any known biological or medical condition should be investigated and ruled out. Remember from our earlier discussion about asking specific questions about the student's level of performance and functioning early on in the evaluation process. This would be one that we would want to consider under that physical and health. Since it's common to demonstrate physical reactions to stress or traumatic events, it is important there is evidence the physical symptoms or fears are frequent and intense and have occurred over a long period of time. For characteristic 5, insufficient progress toward meeting age or grade level academic standards that cannot be explained by intellectual, sensory, or health factors. The insufficient progress is despite appropriate instructional strategies, educational interventions, and targeted interventions and supports. And as a reminder, under IDEA, a child must not be determined to be a child with a disability if the determinant factor for that determination is a lack of appropriate instruction. To answer a question we received at the review of existing data, the IEP team would ask questions and determine if concerns in academic achievement or cognitive learning need to be explored, and would then plan for the necessary assessment tools, which could include an academic achievement or IQ test. This would not be a requirement for all students that were considering an emotional behavioral disability, but would be an individual decision based on those earlier questions that the team would ask. As part of a comprehensive special education evaluation, the suspected reasons for insufficient progress must also be addressed and/or eliminated, such as a specific learning disability, intellectual disability, traumatic brain injury, speech and language impairment, etc. If any one of these other categories is the primary cause, then the IEP team may determine the student is eligible for special education under that category of disability. Such a determination does not necessarily rule out an emotional behavioral disability as an associated disability, since social, emotional, behavioral needs can also be associated with these other categories. Also, the IEP team will need to look beyond academic achievement to determine if the student's significant social and emotional needs or behavioral responses are interfering with their ability to access, engage, or make progress in age or grade level general education curriculum, instruction, environments, or activities. Characteristic 6, isolation from peers or avoidance of social interactions impacting the child's access and engagement in instructional activities. So the isolation or avoidance must be frequent and intense, such that it interferes with the student's learning, participation, relationships, or sense of belonging. The team will need to consider if the student prefers to work or be alone, or if the student demonstrates or expresses a sense of distress and dejection. If the student prefers to be alone, the IEP team will need to consider the impact of that preference on the student's ability to access, engage, or make progress in age or grade level general education, curriculum, instruction, environments, or activities. Another consideration is the exclusion or rejection by peers. Does the student's inhibitions or avoidance restrict the ability of peers to interact with the student? Are there instances of bullying or being bullied that have led to the isolation or avoidance? This examination can help to determine the impact as well as the potential root cause. And to address some questions we have about this characteristic. Teaching and learning do not start and end in the classroom or when the school day starts and ends. Instructional activities are broadly defined. Examples of instructional activities in non-academic settings, home and community, could include activities where parents and family members or community members pass on skills and knowledge that align with family values or traditions, such as cooking or how to pitch a tent, or out-of-school time programs, or learning to play a game. In the community, they could be sports or clubs where skills are taught, like a basketball team, Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts, or music lessons. Characteristic 7 is patterns of behavior across settings and individuals presenting risks to the physical safety of the child or others. This characteristic requires documentation that there is a pattern of behavior and not isolated incidents or behavioral responses that present a risk to the physical safety of the child or others. It does not refer to simple conflict or incidents with one other individual or with certain peers. The IEP team must establish that the behavior is not in response to a specific setting, individual, or relationship. The pattern of behaviors that present the risk to physical safety must be frequent and intense, occur over a long period of time, or of sudden intensity due to an emerging mental health condition in academic and non-academic settings and in the home and community. As we consider the various settings in the rule, it is possible that the observable behaviors may not occur with the same frequency and intensity in all settings. However, again, there must be evidence that they are observed across settings to some degree to ensure the occurrence is not based on a particular or singular situation or relationship. It will be important for IEP teams to consider the ecological factors that may influence the students' observable behaviors in either positive or negative ways. This will not only help with determining whether or not a student has an emotional behavioral disability, but also it will also serve to identify the student's unique needs and the environmental factors that contribute to the student's strengths and challenges. So for academic settings in school, we would include things like direct instruction, small group instruction, independent work completion, group projects, classroom-based activities, community-based instruction, content areas, art, music, physical education, field trips, etc. Non-academic settings in school could include recess, lunch, transition times, the school bus, field trips, playtime, on school grounds before or after school, while waiting for transportation or after arriving to school, and other school-based activities. The IEP team will really need to discuss the expectation in various school settings to determine if they are academic or non-academic. For example, field trips could be either depending on the expectations and the purpose of that field trip. So for home or community, home is where the child lives, whether with parents, foster parents, in a group home, with a relative, etc. And it's important to discuss the specific behavioral responses and to describe what is observed in the home setting. The IEP team is going to need to discuss the student's behavioral responses in the context of the expectations placed on the student in the home, as they may be very different from the expectations that are placed on the student in school. For the community, that's their neighborhood with merchants and recreational activities such as clubs or sports, in church, in community-based vocational training, etc. So particular behavioral responses may not be seen across settings or to the same frequency and intensity, though there should be a pattern. There should be demonstration of at least one of the characteristics to some degree observed in the home or community setting. Some special considerations. We did receive several questions about conducting evaluation and completing the assessment requirements for a student attending a virtual school. So when planning an evaluation for a virtual school, that the IEP team will need to discuss and define what is an academic and non-academic setting at school for the students. They can discuss the possible structure and unstructured activities during the school day, and they can look at the differences in expectations during the various activities when making those decisions. Comparisons with peers in similar circumstances should be used to determine if the observable characteristics occur in virtual academic and non-academic settings. When evaluating a child who has not yet reached the age of mandatory school attendance, the IEP team will consider the activities and settings that are appropriate for a child of that age. Environments may include daycare, preschool, nursery school, playgroups, Head Start, regular education, early childhood programs, including 4-year-old kindergarten, or religious education programs. It is important to focus on the child's behavior across a variety of settings and activities, both structured and unstructured, which could be considered academic or non-academic settings for our younger children. And now we're going to break down the next part of the definition. So the student demonstrates frequent and intense observable behaviors which adversely affect the student's educational performance. The observable behaviors of concern must be more frequent and intense than the normal or typically expected range of behavior for students of a similar age, background, cultural, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, or socioeconomic status. The scope and intensity must be outside of the normal developmental expectations and the student's community or cultural norms. The observable behaviors of concern must be of such rate, frequency, intensity, and duration that they are clearly evident to school staff and others familiar to the student. They must be overt, acute, and observable, and not confined to a single setting or relationship. The observable behaviors must hamper the student's ability to access, engage, and make progress in age or grade level general education curriculum, instruction, environments, or curriculums, or activities, excuse me. Learning and educational performance goes beyond academic performance. Assessing an adverse effect requires the IEP team to consider all aspects of the child's functioning at school, including academic, cognitive, communication, physical and health, independence and self-determination, and social and emotional learning. Educational performance includes all skill areas the student needs in order to participate in, have access to, and make progress in the general education instruction. The term long period of time requires that the student exhibit one or more of the characteristics long enough to be considered chronic, habitual, or persistent. No specific period of time is offered in federal regulations. Differences in the determination of a long period of time may be appropriate based on the individual student and in relation to the chronological age of the student or the intensity of the problem. For example, a long period of inattentiveness is different than a long period of self-injurious behavior. And several months in the life of a 4-year-old may be much more significant than several months in the life of a 14-year-old. The observable behavior should not be symptomatic of a developmental level or a situational stressor, such as parents divorcing, serious illness, or death in the family. In those situations, it is necessary to determine that the behavioral characteristics are continued beyond the expected time for normal adjustment based on the cultural and ethnic norms of the child's community. We received a lot of questions about this part of the rule. of sudden onset due to an emerging mental health condition, which includes a diagnosis by a licensed mental health professional. For some mental health conditions, a student's symptoms may not be evident until there is an acute episode and subsequently become serious enough to cause disruption in the student's ability to concentrate, relate to others, or respond to typical stressors. In those situations, a student may receive a diagnosis by a mental health professional. A diagnosis is not required if the condition of a long period of time has been met, nor is a diagnosis sufficient evidence of special education eligibility. In sudden onset circumstances, there may be a high frequency and intensity of observable behaviors over a shorter period of time or multiple acute episodes. If the student has a diagnosis, the IEP team will document and consider the diagnosis while conducting assessments to investigate whether the symptoms of the diagnosis are evident at school and adversely affect the student's educational performance. The student must exhibit one or more of the characteristics, and the IEP team must consider the data from all of the section requirements. Outside evaluations and other information shared by the family may provide supporting or new information about the student's academic and functional skills important for determining the nature and extent of the student's disability-related and educational needs. Due to the sudden nature of the frequent and intense observable behaviors, the requirement of an evidence-based positive behavioral intervention may be more intensive and may have only occurred during the course of the evaluation cycle in an effort to meet that student's intensive needs. And finally, determining who qualifies as a licensed mental health professional is an IEP team decision. Licensed mental health professionals can include, but are not limited to, a licensed physician, an advanced practice nurse, or a licensed psychologist. In the case of a diagnosis, the licensed mental health professional should provide written documentation of that diagnosis.
All right, and now I am going to wrap us up with a couple of final considerations. Several questions came to us through our survey regarding reevaluations and whether or not there is going to be some sort of different eligibility determination checklists separate from the initial evaluation criteria. And then whether or not reevaluations need to include all of the data and information sources that you see on the slide here that are required for initial evaluations. So again, because the data and information we shared about why we made changes to the rule, the high stakes of the label of emotional behavioral disability, the disproportionality data, the common poor outcomes, both in school and after school for these labels, and the fact that children change a lot in 3 years, that we determined that a comprehensive evaluation every 3 years is really important in almost all cases. That said, teams during the reevaluation process, when that process begins, can certainly use the review of existing data process, that 15-day window to review existing data, to go through the required components of the evaluation and determine if you already have met some of these data collection requirements. So for example, presumably, if you have a student with an emotional behavioral disability that has been receiving special education for 3 years, I would certainly hope that evidence-based positive behavioral interventions have been being done for 3 years. So it's not like you would have to suddenly come up with and create a new evidence-based intervention just during the reevaluation period. Same thing with observations and interviews. You're presumably interacting with that student a lot. members of the IEP team are presumably interacting with that student a lot, probably talking to the parents with some regularity. You're certainly probably observing the student in the classroom, in the hallways, when you're providing specialized instruction, specially designed instruction to that student. So you don't need to redo all of those things during the reevaluation process, with the caveat that, a couple of caveats. One is that data and information that you get from those interviews, those observations, needs to be recent. It needs to be recent enough to give a current picture of the student's functioning. The other thing to consider is making sure that you don't just assume that you've met the observation requirements, that you look at what the rule says about what needs to be included in those observations. So if your progress monitoring observations in the classroom sort of meet the things, the standards that are in the rule, such as you're looking at other ecological factors, that you're doing observations that assess the frequency, the rate, the intensity of a behavior. If you're doing observations in that way as part of the IEP process, the annual IEP process and progress monitoring, and those things are appropriately documented in the IEP, such as for monitoring progress towards IEP goals, then you're obviously not needing to jump through and do a whole bunch of additional observations. So on the checklist, this is the final thing that the team sort of looks at. It's basically a repeat of the definition of the rule that Eva has already covered. And we wanted to wrap up by simplifying this for you as best we could. That Wisconsin's rule change to identifying emotional behavioral disabilities is hopefully a formula for accurate identifications through a comprehensive special education evaluation. The new rule defines the characteristics of emotional behavioral disability in clearly defined, observable, and measurable terms. It requires objective assessment data, which allows teams to focus on the student's strengths and disability-related needs, limits subjectivity and potential bias in the evaluation process, and it requires the results of objectively measured observable characteristics to give the IEP team with the ability to accurately identify whether a student has emotional behavioral disability. And it gives strategies and systems in place to address the impact of bias. It should increase the consistency in the evaluation procedures across schools and across school districts, and in conducting culturally competent evaluations. So ideally, this will assist IEP teams to be objective when identifying the criteria and determining eligibility for special education services. If you have additional questions regarding the rule change, please feel free to contact us. And we do want to acknowledge those of you that submitted questions regarding virtual schools and how these evaluations would work in virtual schools. How they work in early childhood settings, how they might work in sort of fully self-contained special education placements or alternative school settings. Feel free to reach out to us, and we would be more than happy to sort of talk through that with you. It was just not something that was going to neatly fit within the time frame we had today, but don't hesitate to contact either Eva or I. And finally, that was 90 minutes of Eva and I talking very, very quickly. So I'm going to ask for a round of applause for our interpreters, Tracy and Tim, and their help today. And that concludes our webinar, Digging Deeper into Emotional Behavioral Disabilities. Thank you all for attending and hanging out with us to the end.